Hello, Vermont history students. I think you can see me just right. This is the video for Unit 11 of the course, so we really are getting down to the end. And here I am on my porch on Monday, so I'm going to make this. It's Monday about 11. I'll make this, and then I'll go check the town meeting responses. We are getting right down to the end of the course. And two things about that, of course. First, get me your papers, finish up on time. I'd be delighted to get your final. Most of you have given me 2 already, so obviously by Friday at noon at the latest. I'm going to enter my grades are due by Friday at noon. And the second thing is that obviously it's in the syllabus that your contributions to discussion and town meeting are an essential part of your grade. And I will give you credit if you have missed them in the past. You can go back and fill in, give responses to town meeting documents or to discussion questions. Obviously, I won't reward you the same way as I would students who did them on time, because obviously other students are not going to benefit from your wisdom at this point, but still it is work that I will reward you for, and on Friday morning I'll be going back over all of the forums and seeing, and tallying up everyone's responses. And I think that's that as far as that goes. Oh yeah, and so then the way we move forward is there's a discussion question for Unit 11, this one, that's due by Wednesday. And then Unit 12, the last one, there's no discussion question, just a town meeting. And town meetings are usually, as you've seen, due by Monday at noon. This one's due by Friday at noon. No discussion question, but by the end of the week there is a town meeting. And town meeting is based on 3 contemporary issues and a recipe battle. And the issues are Act 46, school consolidation, pot legalization, and illegal Vermont farm workers. And I put links up, I put articles up on the page on the site, so you can get a little bit of background information on them, and then you can have your votes. I don't think you need an instruction page. I think it's good enough. So I think that's everything where we need to be. So this is Unit 11 that goes from about Act 250, 1970 to 2002. And of course Act 250 is the comprehensive, nation's first land use act. It came out of a period when development was happening really quickly. So quickly that there was that beckoning country advertising campaign that the state had, and it was so successful in the 60s they had to cancel it. Because there was too much of a good thing, too much development, and the despoilation of the very thing that Vermont was selling. And huge condo developments were going up, and so there was this need for comprehensive management of growth, because the growth affects your schools and mail delivery and utilities and roads and a host of things, and scenery, obviously. And so Vermont entered into the 1970s with this strong environmental ethic, and that increasingly built, and its reputation as being an environmental sort of left-leaning state built over the course of the 1970s. The 1970s was the first decade since the decade 1800 to 1810 that Vermont's population grew faster than the national rate for the first time in 180 years, and 170 years. So anyway, Vermont had to deal with this growth, and it did so by increasingly managing the land and increasingly having regulations, and a lot of downhillers thought things were going great. And into the 1980s, Vermont increasingly became a Democratic Party-controlled state. There we have Vermont governors. It's sort of Vermont tradition is to trade back and forth, but certainly the legislature. Vermont had been a profoundly Republican state since the Civil War, since before the Civil War. And the old saying is, it's not that Vermont changed, it's that the Republican Party changed. Obviously Mississippi becoming a Republican state was really weird for a lot of people, although now it's commonplace. So Vermont was changing, and its economy was obviously evolving, and we've talked about the decline of the old economy, and taking its place was technology and education and medicine and new forms of agriculture, as opposed to the old heavy industries and small industries and extractive industries and dairy farming. And so it's like Vermont made this transition smooth as far as downhillers felt. And this is sort of summarized by the Ben and Jerry's becoming sort of the iconic thing that people associate with the state by the late 1980s. And so things are going great, as downhillers think. But the impact of this on the uphill population was to marginalize them, a process of marginalization that had been taking place ever since tourism kicked in big time in the 1890s, as you've seen, as we followed. And it is that reversal of the pattern where in the Gilded Age, the downhillers lived in urban centers, uphillers lived in rural places, downhillers wanted development, uphillers wanted small farms well-tilled. And by the time you reach the 1980s, 1990s, downhillers increasingly live out in the country on big estates, you know, on big, large properties. Uphillers live in the urban centers because rent is cheap, and increasingly they're not a part of the state, you know. And I'm very aware of that being the problem. Like, where do uphillers fit into this new model for Vermont? And one example of that is it's a work of fiction, but I put it online for you, Chapter 6 from Wallace Stegner's wonderful book, Crossing to Safety, written in the 1980s. And to summarize it, you can read the chapter and see some of the pictures. But here's the deal. There's a family, the father is a professor at Harvard of English, professor of English at Harvard, and they have a summer home in Greensboro on Lake Caspian. And this grubby graduate student who's in love with one of the daughters of the professor, and he's one of his graduate students, drives up and visits her because he has a crush on her. And they having this discussion, and they say, oh, it's so horrible that the farmer who lives across the bay from us has sold his property, and they're going to build a resort there with a roller skating rink and movie theater and restaurants and a boating dock, and it's going to be noisy and loud and boats coming in and out. It's going to ruin our view. It's going to ruin the lake for us. And it turns out this graduate student, Sid is his name, is filthy rich. He pretends not to be rich, but it turns out he'd inherited a lot of money from his father. And so he just buys up all the property, offers the farmer twice what the developers were offering him. And it's like, yay, now Vermont will remain beautiful and scenic and wonderful, which is great for the people who own summer homes on Lake Caspian. But what about all the local people? I mean, there's going to be no jobs. What about the jobs waiting tables and working in the movie theater and tending the lawn and working in the hotel and all those things? But that doesn't seem to be a consideration for these people, which Wallace Stegner, who had a summer home on Lake Caspian, was very aware of. And so you get into the 1990s, and the tension has been building for a century, and it builds and builds and builds and builds. And then in 1999, Vermont's Supreme Court ruled that same-sex couples deserve the same legal rights as heterosexual couples. And the process of bringing about civil unions, downhillers thought was very democratic. There's state house hearings, and anyone in the state could get up and talk for 3 minutes. And then they hammered out a compromise bill that wasn't marriage. And it seemed, you know, by 2000, when civil unions were enacted, downhillers felt like, what a great state we live in. We have really shaped the state to be this wonderful, inclusive place. But how inclusive was it? And the backlash ended up being this movement called Take Back Vermont. Some of you might have seen the signs that are still sometimes, you see them around in Vermont. But Take Back Vermont, a lot of downhillers interpreted as being against civil unions exclusively. It was homophobic, they thought. And it was a really stark difference. I was teaching at UVM at the time, and like people in Burlington had no idea what was going on. And my job at the time meant that I had to drive around the state a bunch. And you drive out to the, you know, Orange County, and there'd be Take Back Vermont signs everywhere. And go back to Burlington, there wouldn't be any. It was a real stark difference. And the thing was that Take Back Vermont was partially for some people about a backlash against civil unions, but it was about stop pushing us around. Stop making all these regulations and stop marketing the state in a way that makes us irrelevant to the state's future, and stop manipulating our schools. And how come downhillers get everything they want? And it was a great time in the state. It was wonderful to be there at the time. Everyone's arguing about who is and who isn't a Vermonter. It was great, although it was very tense and not very civil. And it was a period that, you know, Vermont really in some ways had to go through, but unfortunately not a whole lot was accomplished because the old traditional dynamic was at work. Instead of the uphillers had totally the wrong approach to it. Instead of saying share Vermont and talking across the divide to downhillers, they were just talking to themselves. Take back Vermont. And it's like, take it back to when? Before downhillers were there, what, the 1770s, or at least before reapportionment in 1965? It's not going to happen. And downhillers were like, well, how come you're so homophobic? And so you don't see the big picture. And so uphillers, you didn't see the big picture, and downhillers didn't understand uphillers, and phew, they were going right past each other. But it was an important thing that Vermont go through that. And the last this discussion question, the last one for the semester, I have for you is just not only for civil unions and Take Back Vermont, but looking back, is conflict, social conflict like we had in Vermont in 2000 and 2001, is that a good thing? As Vermont attempts to make its way towards reconciliation